Welcome back in, everybody. It's good to see you today. We are covering the Las Vegas Raiders. I hope you're doing well. Believe me when I say it is a privilege and a pleasure for me to get to bring these videos to you, however often and however sloppy they may be when I get to do them. But thank you for watching today. This is going to be a sloppy video. I've got a bigger board than what I used to have, and no doubt I have put way too much information on today's board. So I'm just going to tell you up front, this will be a long video. It'll be a little sloppy. We'll be a little all over the place. I'm just covering the highlights today of what the Raiders did during this offseason, the draft and in free agency, and the players that they said goodbye to. So this is just the highlights. We are not going to do a deep dive into any position today. Hopefully, I hope as the summer goes along, we'll start diving into more of these position groups and taking a look at each of the position groups and really start doing the deep dive on some of these things. So I want to say at the outset, when I look at the Raiders and where they were at the end of last year, which is 7-9, with they started off 6-4, and the wagon wheels just kind of fall off. When I look at what they've done this offseason, and I'm looking ahead to 2020, I think the Raiders are a playoff football team. When I look at them and what they've upgraded and what they've done, I think this is a 9-7 team at least. I would be very disappointed if this is any less than a 9-7 football team. I would peg this at about a 10-6 football team, and they could go as high as 11 or 12 wins, always depending on how things work out with other teams and with injuries and things like that. And we'll talk today specifically about why I think that this is a playoff team. Now, have I done a deep dive on the rest of the AFC teams to know who you're competing with for that playoff spot? The answer is no. I haven't done that. Have I looked at the Raiders' schedule and broke it down week by week to see how it projects and the win-loss game? Haven't done that either. This is just looking at the Raiders roster and what they did and didn't do this offseason. And I think that this is a 10-6 football team. I would say 9-7 at the worst. Even if you do have a couple of injuries, I still think this is a 9-7 football team. And I think moving ahead, if everything starts to click and fall in place, I think this is a team that could win 10 or 11 football games this year. And so I would peg them around 10-6. Let's take a look today and see why I think that is. When I looked at last year's team, to me, the worst part of the Raiders was the defense, and specifically the worst part of the defense was the back seven. When we look at modern NFL defenses, we don't talk about the front seven anymore. That used to be the case as you went all through the 50s, the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, and even the early 2000s. We always talked about the front seven for an NFL defense, and really that left the back four on an island to kind of work out pass coverage themselves. Today that has been flipped, and we talk about the back seven, that is the CBs, the safeties, and the linebackers as a group in pass coverage, and it's those front four, the defensive line, that is kind of left on their own to stop the run and largely get pressure on the quarterback. The linebackers, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, have been converted into pass coverage just in an effort to slow down some of these fast-moving, rules-friendly offenses that have been developed these days. That was the weakness, and that is really, when you step back and look at it, not wide receiver and not edge rusher. The reason the Raiders did not get in the playoffs last year, the biggest reason, not the only reason, but the biggest reason is right here, the back seven, CB, safety, and linebacker. And the Raiders did not ignore that this offseason. They paid careful attention to it. We'll start right here with CB. In the CB position, they lost Darryl Worley for about $3 million to Dallas. Worley is a guy who I actually would have liked to have kept for $3 million. Already been in the Raiders system for a while. Decent pass coverage guy, not necessarily your starter, but a great depth guy, really capable of holding down kind of that frequent, sometimes occasional starter position, depth position when you switch over into nickel and dime, which most NFL defenses play all the time these days. This was a good guy to have for $3 million, but he's gone, so you'll miss that a little bit, but they've done a good job addressing that here in the draft with Damon Arnett. You've got Mullen back there coming back for a second season out of Clemson, so what that does, that gives you two very young CBs, and then of course you add in here Robertson. It'll be interesting to see what we get from Robinson. I thought A lot of teams this year in the draft could have drafted Robertson from Louisiana Tech a lot higher, and because he's a smaller type of a player from a smaller type of a school, I think both of those factors together kind of kept him down in the draft. Had he been a smaller type player from a bigger school, or had he been a bigger player from a smaller school, I think you would have seen him on up in the higher rounds. Even so, the Raiders get him here. Smaller guy from a smaller school. I think he can contribute in the NFL. Do I necessarily see him being some kind of a starter in the NFL, a CB1 or CB2 as the years go forward? I really don't. But I do think this guy can contribute, and I do think you made the CB position better. Matter of fact, Robertson basically, to me, takes over the role that Worley left here, and then you have Arnett. Now, Arnett's an interesting pick. I know some of you love that, and some of you don't like that. I'm not going to be a huge proponent either way on the Arnett pick, but I do like the fact that the Raiders address the CB position. And honestly, in all truthfulness, Arnett probably would not have been the CB that I would have picked if I were the Raiders right there at that spot. Having said that, when you look at Arnett, most of his concerns are not about his talent or his athleticism or his ability. It's about other things such as attitude or off-the-field issues. So as long as Arnett can get in there and work and focus, I think talent-wise, you've got a guy right here at CB. Same thing with Mullen. I think talent-wise, you've got guys here who are capable, fully capable of being CB1s and CB2s in the future. So I don't think talent is an issue at all at CB when you look at Arnett and when you look at Robertson and when you add Mullen back into the mix. Those three guys, I think talent-wise at CB, you are now very rich with talent at what was 2 seasons ago a very talent-poor position group. At CB, you have a lot of talent. Now, obviously, the issue now is this. You're also very young. You are incredibly young. These guys are going to have growing pains. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to get beaten badly at times, either through busted coverage or just mental lapses. That is going to happen. That is just a part of having this kind of talent this young. The other side of that then is this. At safety right here, the Raiders went out and got, Randall and Heath, Demarius Randall and Jeff Heath at safety. Now, you have the reverse problem here with Randall and Heath. You pick up Demarius Randall for 1 year at $2 million, and you pick up Jeff Heath 2 years for $6 million. Whereas at CB, you had three guys really, who were very talented, appear to be extremely talented and extremely athletic, but they're incredibly young. At safety, you actually have the reverse problem. With Randall and Heath, you have two guys who are very solid. They've been very consistent. Not a lot of ups and downs in their career. They have been very consistent. Randall has actually played CB in his career, and the Raiders, if they wanted to, could even move him back to CB if they wanted to. But for the most part, he's going to be at safety, I think. And of course, Heath, of course, is going to be at safety. The reverse problem is this. When you're looking at safety for the Raiders, you have guys here who athletically are kind of capped out, a little bit limited with what they can do. Matter of fact, I think if you were to take all of the safeties in the NFL and you were to have a draft with all the NFL teams using all the safeties, free and strong, I don't think that Randall or Heath would be picked in the first round, if you will, by any of the NFL teams. They would be looking more like picks 35 through 45 before you get to Randall and Heath. But I think both of those guys would be gone very quickly in the early second round if you were drafting safeties only. So I think a little bit here with these two safeties, and again, the price is right on these guys. You cannot get better price here on two safeties who have had plenty of starting experience, and Randall's a guy who's very flexible, can go from CB to safety. He's looked much better at safety in Cleveland than he did at CB in Green Bay. But Heath here and Randall both, the price is absolutely right here. The Raiders have done a marvelous job, an absolutely marvelous job of solidifying the safety position here with only $2 million for Randall and then $3 million for Heath. This is an exceptionally marvelous job from a financial standpoint that the Raiders have done of really solidifying that safety position. And you mix in, give me a second, I'm looking for my other guy here at safety. You mix in Harris, of course, at safety, who has some starting experience. When you mix Harris in with Randall and Heath, you have three guys here who are capable of starting in the NFL, and you don't feel like you are going to get exposed time after time after time with these three players at safety. You also don't feel like necessarily that you have a whole world of talent back there at safety, that you have guys who can just come in and start to shut down a position, shut it down in the running game, shut it down with court pressure on the quarterback, shut it down in guarding anybody. You don't have anybody like that back there at safety, but that's okay. If the CBs, and this is important, when you're looking at the secondary by itself without even mixing the linebackers in, if you look at the CBs, if they talent-wise can step up and start to fulfill that talent that we think they've got, and that's Mullen and that's Arnett, if they can start to fulfill that talent, and these two guys right here, Randall and Heath, and then Harris at times, with their experience, even though I think Heath and Randall are limited athletically, limited talent-wise, I think they're so solid back there and so consistent, and they have proven that for several seasons now in the NFL. I think that's a very good mix. Now, my thought is this, and I still have questions here in the secondary. I don't feel, and we're going to upgrade the board here in just a minute, I don't feel as if you are in the wonderful, giggly, excited area about your secondary. I think there's still questions. The thought is this: if the CB position starts to break down this season, as the season goes on, if either Mullen or Arnett, either one, start to struggle to cover, if they really start to struggle in coverage, or Mullen starts to regress, if that were to start happening, I do think that the safety position, their lack of athleticism, their lack of top-end talent, if you will, could at times, not consistently get burned, but could at times start to get exposed. But I think as long as Randall and Heath are back there doing consistently what they've been doing for the past 2 or 3 seasons, and if Mullen and Arnett can continue to develop and kind of hold their own in coverage, I think this is a very solid secondary. I don't think it's a top 5 or a top 10 secondary, but I do think that instead of being this mess right here, where you consistently got beaten and burned last year in 2019 by opposing defenses, I think instead you have something now that is solid. So I'm going to change this in the color scheme from CB in the red, which is obviously in the danger area, and we're going to turn that to the blue, which is just for solid. And same thing here for safety, okay? At safety, I think instead of being in the red area, I think now you've upgraded that into the blue area, not the green area where I just feel wonderful about it and I feel like we've absolutely got everything covered without any real questions. Depth-wise, you're good. Even if somebody starts to get an injury, I think you have the depth here. And just having, you know, you often see this in free agency or in the draft. You'll see people start to refer to teams bringing in somebody for depth and flexibility. And a lot of times you have somebody who really isn't even good enough to be a backup, and so you have no depth. But for the Raiders right here, because I think you have with Robertson, and then you have here with Heath and Randall and Harris in the safety position, and your CBs, when you have that, you have depth here as well. So even if somebody were to go down with an injury, you have some good depth there, I think, if you're the Raiders in the secondary. Now, I talked about the back 7 being a unit, so we need to talk about linebacker, because the Raiders have completely redone their linebacker position. And I think I referred to it during an earlier video, the linebacker position in 2019 basically being a dumpster fire for the Raiders this year, and that's about what it was. And the Raiders did not ignore that. I'm sure this is something they were well aware of all on their own. The Raiders addressed the linebacker position, and they addressed it very seriously, and it was horrible for the linebacker position. But my opinion is they have done such a good job of addressing the linebacker position that it not only is not in the red any longer, I think it's in the green. I think this is one of the not top 5 linebacker positions in the NFL, but I think this is one of the upper third linebacker groups now in the NFL. Is the depth there? Not necessarily, but they've upgraded enough. Let's talk about that. You lose right here to Whitehead. Whitehead's a guy who had talent, never could seem to develop, never could seem to live up to that. Was he producing? Yes, at times. Was he on the field a lot? Yes, he was, but he never really seemed to live up to the talent level that it looked like he had. So he's gone to Carolina for $2.5 million. It's always a good sign, and this is something to watch as the market goes up and down. It's always a good sign when you make a decision to let a player go and he signs with another team in free agency for a lot less than what you were paying him the previous season. Last year, you were paying him, or you were going to have to pay him this year, I think about $6-7 million. You saved $6 million in the cap space by letting him go. He goes to Carolina for only $2.5 million. And what that means is that the rest of the NFL is not chasing something that you thought was not worth a whole lot. So they let go of Tahir Whitehead. You're not going to miss anything there in performance. What did you get back instead? You go out in free agency and you get two guys here, Akatsuki and Littleton. They also over here pick up Tanner Muse from Clemson. We'll talk about Muse in a second. Akatsuki is kind of an old school, old style linebacker, and I think the name bears that out, starts to bring to mind some players from the 60s for the NFL. This is a guy who does a little bit of everything. He doesn't do anything well. He's okay in pass coverage, but he's solid against the run. He's solid in getting pressure on the quarterback. You sign him for 3 years, $21 million. This is one thing that is very consistent this year about the Raiders free agent signings. None of them were high risk. Absolutely none of them. Akatsuki, 3 years, $21 million. If you decide after one season that you want to get out, you can for a moderate dead cap hit. If you decide Akatsuki just looks horrible, he looks absolutely terrible on the field in 2020, you could let him go after one season. I think after 2 seasons, you could let him go for no dead cap hit. So you're only tied to him for 2 seasons at the most. 1 season if you really truly just want to let go of him. I don't think that's going to be the case. Akatsuki had an outstanding year last year. He was one of, I think, the better starting linebackers in the league last year. Really performed well. He's consistent at everything, not great at anything, but this is a guy who's absolutely Akatsuki is going to step in and lock down a starting spot, and I don't think anybody's going to take that away from him. Okay, so for 3 years, $21 million, that's a good investment. It's not high risk, and you've locked down a spot that previously was completely in the red. Just an absolute horrible position there at linebacker for the Raiders with Akatsuki. Now, the guy that I really get excited about here at linebacker for the Raiders is Littleton. Cost you a little bit more money. 3 years, $35 million. So that is, I think, just north of 11, maybe south of $12 million a season. You guys can do the math. Littleton as well, though, and I don't think this is going to be a concern at all, but you always have to wonder if this guy shows up for our team and he gets out on the field and all of a sudden he's kind of stinking up the joint and he doesn't look as good as he did for the other team when he was playing for the other guys, and we decide we want to let him go. How long are we married to this guy for? In Littleton's case, you're basically you're tied to him for 2 seasons. Financially, that's basically the hit that you're looking at. But I'm excited about Littleton. Littleton is more of your modern day NFL linebacker. He's the guy who is very, very good in pass coverage. And he's not just good in pass coverage for a linebacker, he is just good in pass coverage. So running backs coming out of the backfield, guys that you need to cover who can scout all over the place, he can get on these guys. Could he stay with them for an extended period of time as they move all up and down the football field at 30 yards deep? Maybe not so much then. But the Raiders don't have to worry about that because of the defense that they have put together. I don't expect that Littleton's going to be asked to cover running backs that far down the field without any help. But he, more to the point, can cover tight ends. He can cover these guys and cover them very well. He is not bad in rushing the quarterback. He's also decent in covering the run, so he's not hurting you at those spots. He's not any much of a downgrade at all over what you had at linebacker last season. So he's decent. He's very decent, very solid in run coverage. He's also decent in getting pressure on the quarterback, not as good as he is in run coverage. His real strength, though, is in pass coverage. So when we talk about the back 7, and again, it's that back 7 the NFL defenses are using these days in pass coverage, and linebackers are a huge, huge, massive part of that. You have upgraded your pass coverage here without even talking about the CBs and safeties, which we already have, and we've already seen the upgrade there. Right here at linebacker with Littleton, you have done a massive upgrade here. And so for those tight ends, when they start working in the 10, 15-yard area, when the running backs start to slide out on wheel routes and on screens, you have guys here with Littleton and Akatsuki who can step up. They are not soft against the run. They are solid against the run. Akatsuki is solid in coverage, and Littleton for a linebacker is exceptional in coverage, and even if you take off the 4 linebacker tag, Littleton is exceptional in pass coverage, running backs, and tight ends. You didn't spend a whole ridiculous amount of money here. $11 or $12 million a season is a lot on the linebacker end, but I think Littleton is going to be worth it. And again, if for whatever reason, if Littleton or Akatsuki get an injury, or they just don't look like they're performing, you're only tied to them for 1 or 2 seasons at the most. You're not tied to them for a lot longer than that. So when you step back over here, this was the weakness of the Raiders last year. This was the weakness of the defense. This was where you were absolutely bleeding at. This was what kept you out of the playoffs. Maybe not when you just look at the tail end of the season or this game or that game, but when you step back and look at the whole season as a whole, it was the secondary that really kept you out of the playoffs as the season went along. And you have upgraded that all the way across the board. CB and safety still have some questions, but I think you feel good about that as a package, and you have definitely upgraded those 2 positions. Will Heath and Randall be starters as you get into 2021 and 22? Probably not. You'll probably see one of those guys fall off. You'll probably see the Raiders try to address that either free or strong safety position in the draft in 2021 offseason. But for now, you have upgraded those spots. You should not be bleeding at those spots. You should not have major exposed holes and burns every single week. You should be solid there at CB and safety, and you should be excellent here at linebacker. Haven't even talked about Tanner Muse. Tanner Muse is a guy, I don't know, and again, this is where I would really start to lean on people who watch even more videotape than I do. I watch some video. I don't watch an exorbitant amount of video on guys who are coming out of the draft. When you look at Tanner Muse here, I see a guy who is not ready to start in the NFL right away. I see a guy here, though, who could, as the years progress and his career progresses, could step up and possibly start in the NFL. But I think he is good enough, absolutely, right now. I think he's good enough to contribute. I think in all phases of the game, I think he can contribute in pass coverage, in stopping the run, and then even at times getting pressure on the quarterback. I think Muse is ready to step in and contribute right away. I would not want to hand him a starting spot if I was a team that didn't have Akatsuki and Littleton at linebacker. I would not feel good about Tanner Muse being my starting linebacker. I would not want to pencil him in. But for this season, I think he's in a perfect spot right here to contribute to the Raiders and to help right away here at linebacker, taking pressure off of these other 2 linebackers. If they want to load up with linebackers on certain plays here, you can do that with Tanner Muse. I do think he is good enough. This is not just a body. I do think he is good enough right away to add depth and flexibility. Now, you'll hear musings. You'll hear people talk about Muse maybe slipping up to safety. I really don't anticipate that. I just cannot, when you look at the film, I just cannot myself see Muse being athletic enough to slide up there to the safety role in the NFL. I know he did it in college. He did it at a great program. He went up against great programs very often in the championship and in the playoffs. He went up against great programs. But I cannot, when I look at the video, I don't see how Muse's athleticism translates to being a safety in the NFL. So I do not expect that. I expect him to be there exclusively at linebacker. And most of the sites that I rely on to get an opinion from seem to agree with that thought, that Muse is going to settle in right there at linebacker. I would not anticipate seeing him there at safety, but we'll see what the Raiders want to do with that as always. There's no red on the board here, even if I didn't change anything else here. We've taken away all of the horrible, danger, worrisome spots. Now, some people, and I mentioned this, some people refer to wide receiver as a desperate need spot for the Raiders, and it just wasn't. When you looked at the Raiders' offense last year, it moved the football up and down the field consistently all season long. And with Derek Carr sitting there at quarterback, to me, he's an easy top 12 kind of a quarterback. Some seasons even a top 10 kind of a quarterback. He already had weapons with Waller and with Moreau there at tight end. He had a running back there in Jacobs who really took a lot of pressure off. He had Richards and Washington to throw the ball to out of the running back spot. And then you mix in the fact that he had Renfro and Williams there, who were decent wide receivers there. I just didn't view wide receiver as being a danger zone for the Raiders, not being an emergency spot for the Raiders. I thought it was a position that if they had wanted to address other positions like edge rusher or secondary or anything that they wanted to go after this offseason, I thought they had the freedom there at wide receiver. And I really disagreed with, this is just my opinion, I really disagreed with people who said they had to go wide receiver, they had to get a wide receiver. But when you show up here at this spot in the draft and you get Ruggs, and the Raiders basically had their pick of wide receivers, I thought it was a very good decision, a smart decision, an easy decision, kind of a layup here to go wide receiver. I would not have been at all bothered, and I forget if they picked first or if the Jets picked first. I wouldn't have been at all bothered if the Raiders had gotten CeeDee Lamb from Oklahoma, or if they had gotten the other kid from Alabama, the other wide receiver as well. Any of those three guys to me would have been an upgrade at wide receiver here. And so even though I didn't think, and I've got them in the blue here, at the end of last offseason, I did not think that this was a need position as far as, did Carr need more weapons to throw to? He had weapons to throw to last year. He had a good 4 or 5 guys here last season at tight end, at running back, and at wide receiver to get the football to, so he had plenty of weapons. And in today's NFL, the lines have blurred at several positions, and I'm blathering on here for a second, but there's a point to be made. The lines have blurred greatly from tight end to running back to wide receiver. Basically at all these positions, even if you got a guy who can run at running back, you want somebody who can catch the ball in the backfield. Even if you've got a guy at tight end who can block, what you really want is somebody who can catch, and they may be just as fast as some of the wide receivers, just a bigger version. So the lines have blurred here. What you really want when you look at a modern day NFL offense, whether it's wide receiver, tight end, or running back, you just want somebody who can catch the ball. And if you've got 4 or 5 of those guys, then you're going to have a good offense if you've got the quarterback to go along with it. The Raiders had that last year. Now, they've got a better offense now, no doubt to it. When you add Ruggs in, who is an absolute speed burner, I think his game translates to the NFL. I don't think he's just a speed demon. I think this is a guy who can catch the ball. And this is where you really have to be dangerous if you're copying the Chiefs or trying to catch up to the Chiefs. The Chiefs have a lot of speed, yes, but more to the point, they have fast guys who can catch the football. So when you look at Ruggs, you're not just drafting a guy who is fast. That would be a tragic mistake. You have a guy here who it appears can catch the football and catch the football consistently, and he fights for the football. And this is a guy who understands about running routes as well. This is a good receiver. He is not just a fast guy. He is a good wide receiver. And so this is a definite upgrade here at wide receiver over Renfro, over Williams, both of whom you get to keep. And then on top of that, you add in Edwards from South Carolina, who a lot of people thought, and again, I did not look at much film coverage on Edwards, but a lot of people thought that Edwards could have been drafted higher. The wide receiver position was so deep that you just started to see teams kind of not need wide receiver as much as the draft went on, and therefore the Raiders end up picking 2 guys who I think can be starters in the NFL. When you look at Ruggs, I think this is a guy who has the potential, again, it's potential, to be wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 in the NFL. I think when you look at Edwards, I don't see wide receiver 1 there, but I think you have a guy here who has the potential to be a wide receiver 2 in the NFL. And so I think you've upgraded, no doubt, even if you just drafted one of these guys, I think you've already upgraded at wide receiver. When you look at drafting both of these guys here at wide receiver, there's no question you've upgraded. Even if only one of these guys pans out, the other one's a complete flop. I don't think there's any question here when you get to the wide receiver spot, instead of just being in the blue area, I think now you're in the green area. That's just my opinion on it, my take. Some of you may see that different, but I think you have here the makings of a heck of an offense here if you're the Raiders. And that's important. You never want to try to match a certain team. That's bad strategy. That's horrible strategy. You don't want to try to catch up to a certain team. That's not the way to build your own team. But there's no question about it. The Raiders here, without losing any ground at certain positions on offense, have actually gotten better. You have Derek Carr coming back. Now you have weapons all over the place. And we haven't even talked about running back yet. Oh, by the way, they drafted a guy here with Bowden out of Kentucky who is basically half wide receiver, half running back. And I don't think he's good enough yet to be a starter in the NFL. but he doesn't have to be. You've got Jacobs here and you've got Richards, and they let go of Washington. Washington goes to Kansas City for about $1 million. That's a good pickup for Kansas City. Washington's the kind of running back who can kind of do a little bit of everything. The Raiders let him go because they really didn't need him, because they've got Jalen Richards right there at running back, and there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between Richards and Washington at running back. So that we figured they would let one of those guys go. They did. They let Washington go. Washington actually signed for less money than what I thought he would have. You've got Richards there who can catch the ball at the backfield. Jacobs, we have yet to see if he's going to be that effective of a catcher out of the backfield, although he can. Jacobs is a stout runner there for the Raiders, really quite a weapon as a running back there. And now you have all kinds of weapons all over the field for Derek Carr. Did you have to have that? Could you have gone after edge rusher and continued to upgrade the defense if you were the Raiders? Yeah, absolutely. The wide receiver spot, contrary to some media outlets, was not an emergency position, but the Raiders upgraded it, and now to me, you're in the green here because you have Renfro, because you have Williams, because you have Ruggs, because you have Edwards. You have 4 guys there at wide receiver, all of whom I think can catch the ball, several of whom are fast, a couple of whom are big. I think Edwards will actually help you more in the red zone. If he's ready to play football in the NFL, I think Edwards will help you more in the red zone than Ruggs will, but I think Ruggs will help you in the big play aspect in order to maybe have fewer red zone trips than you even had last year, just because you're scoring touchdowns from outside the red zone more often. You bring Bowden in. Here's a guy here at running back. There's no pressure on him to start. There's not even any real pressure on him to play. If Richards and Jacobs need to carry the load, they're fully capable of it. You work in Bowden whenever you feel like it. If you want to work him out in the slot, you can do that. If you want to work him out of the backfield, you can do that. He's an athlete. And in today's NFL, the way it's structured, the way the rules are, and the way offenses are structured these days, very much, Bowden's got a place in the NFL. You don't really have to figure out a position for him. You just plug him in wherever you want to, and you teach him in training to kind of run his pattern from there. And I don't know how often Bowden will get the football straight up handing the football off to him. We'll see about that. I'd rather just, if I'm going to hand the ball off, I'd rather hand it off to Jacobs than I would to Bowden. But he's fully capable of running the football to a degree as well. But this is really more of a wide receiver here who plays the running back position, and is going to be very effective doing that, and not have to bear the burden, the pressure as a rookie of stepping in and starting. So no doubt here, the running back position was already good. It stays good with Jacobs and with Richards and now with Bowden. And what you're starting to see here is that the Raiders are doing 2 things. They don't just have solid starters or very good starters at some of these positions. They've also been able to build some depth here at some of these positions. And the reason depth is important, and it's so important, it's not just some word that we toss out there. The reason depth is important is because the NFL is such a violent game. You have some of the biggest, toughest people in the world coming together every Sunday and just beating the snot out of each other. And even though today's game is not as violent or as hard as it was in the 60s or as it was in the 80s, it's still a violent game. And you have these people just beating up on each other every single week for 17 weeks straight. And then for some of these teams, a third of these teams, you add on the playoffs. Injuries are not just something you hope to avoid. Injuries are something that you expect. Injuries are a way of life, and your starters are more likely to get injured than your backups because your starters are on the field more often. So injuries are going to happen, and the Raiders are doing an excellent job here of not just adding bodies in, but of adding players who bring depth, who, if they had to start for 4 weeks, or if they had to start in the playoffs, you don't feel overly worried about it. Is there a little bit of a drop-off here from the starter? Yes, there is. But no matter where you turn here for the Raiders, at wide receiver or at tight end or in the secondary, linebacker's a little weak as far as the depth goes, but you're not too bad there. Defensive end, the defensive tackle, which we haven't even covered yet today, you've got depth there. We'll cover offensive line in a second. You've got depth there. Haven't even covered the backup quarterback position, which we'll talk about in a second. The Raiders have fixed themselves up to where not only do they have a roster that is good enough to win, good enough to go 9-7, 10-6, maybe 11-5, maybe even if everything were to just fit together and fall just perfectly, maybe even in your hopes and dreams, maybe a 12-4 team. I don't project that. I project 10-6. But even if you had an injury to that roster, which is good enough to do that, you've got the depth there to keep trucking on through that. And so when you say next man up, you're not just quoting some phrase off of a movie. You have a next man up there who is capable of taking on that role. And we see this consistently from the Raiders all over the place. And that is so important in the NFL because these injuries are going to happen. By week 8 or by week 12, you're going to have injuries in several different places. And you're prepared for that. You are ready for that. So the Raiders here have done an excellent job, and that's one reason why I said when I predict that this team would go 9-7 and no less than 9-7, that's because they had done such a good job here with the backups, with the rotation guys. They have done such an excellent job of that. You expect the injuries, but when the injuries happen, you don't expect much of a drop-off here. Are you going to see some difference? Yes, absolutely. Can you scheme for a little bit of that? Yeah, you can. But the guy stepping in, that next man up, if you will, is ready to take on that role. And I think you see that all over the place, with the possible exception of linebacker, where you're a little bit thin on the depth side. But I don't think that's going to be a huge issue here. You also have Morrow coming back, who, even though I would not want him starting, he has had a lot of experience playing here for you. And you've got Tanner Muse coming in, who, again, I wouldn't want starting, but I think is capable of contributing. So I think the Raiders here, I'd be extremely disappointed if I saw anything less than 9-7 out of the Raiders this year. And again, I haven't looked at all the other NFL teams, and I haven't looked at the schedule, but that's just looking at this roster right here. We'll try to adjust that and tinker that as the offseason goes on. Let's finish up here the last 15 minutes or so by talking about some of these other positions. Defensive, let's see, we covered CB, safety and linebacker. Defensive end, when you look here, another big signing by the Raiders, Carl Nassib, 3 years, $25 million. Nassib is another guy here who isn't great at anything. And again, if you were to hold a draft here for defensive ends, Nassib definitely wouldn't get picked in the first round of NFL teams. It would probably be midway through the second round before he got picked. But nonetheless, Nassib is a solid starter here in the NFL. And if he produces for you the way he produced at his last stop, which I think was Tampa Bay, I forgive him if I'm wrong on that, but if he produces for you the way he produced there, this is a guy who, again, is going to lock down a starter spot. You're not going to have to worry about him. And what that does, what this really does also, is takes pressure off of your two younger guys that you have there with Crosby and with Farrell. You would really love, in a dream case scenario, you would love to see Trayvon Mullen and Cleveland Farrell step up and just lock onto that starter position, and possibly even, maybe not this year, but in 2021, 2022, start to get some attention for Pro Bowls, okay? That's kind of the expectation when you draft guys who appear to be this good and you draft them this high. Even if they don't, even if they're just kind of decent guys who are questionable starters, kind of holding on to a starting spot, when you sign a guy like Carl Nassib, this allows you to basically just not worry about one starter spot. This guy should be able to lock down the starter spot. He's solid in the run. He's solid at getting pressure on the quarterback. For a defensive end, he's decent at dropping back in the pass coverage. But this guy is very consistent. Nassib is very, very consistent. Did you overpay for him? Maybe a little bit. That's going to happen in free agency. The definition of the word free agency in the NFL is basically overpay. Again, though, if Nassib doesn't work out, you're not tied to him for a long time. I think after one season, the dead cap hit, if you wanted to let him go, is relatively modest. I want to say $5 to $7 million to let him go. So it's not very steep, but basically you're tied to him for 2 seasons, so you get a chance to see if he's going to work out or not. Once again, this is a relatively young player. I think he's about 26, give or take a year. Relatively young player, should maybe even still develop a little bit more if you can make him comfortable in your defense. So this adds to depth. This is a solid starter right here. And what this allows you to do is hopefully Farrell steps up and takes over that other starting edge rusher position and really starts to grow and develop. And then you have Crosby there to swing between the 2 defensive end positions. and hopefully Crosby continues to develop as well. So it gives you 3 guys there at defensive end who you could plug in as starters and not feel like you were going to get exposed. It gives you 1 guy here for certain with Farrell that you feel like could step up and even be a Pro Bowl kind of a player. I don't see Muse necessarily as pushing for Pro Bowls, but this is a very solid starter, and you hope that Crosby can continue to be a very solid player there as well. So that's defensive end. You lose Deion Jordan and Benson Mayowa. You lose a little bit of depth here, and again, these are guys, Worley, Jordan, Mayowa. These are guys that I would have loved to see the Raiders bring back. Mayowa goes to Seattle for $3 million. Relatively modest. Mayowa's the kind of guy who you could plug in as a starter. You would rather not. You would rather have him coming in and providing depth, not only in the rotation throughout a single game, just eating up some of those snaps so your starters aren't so tired, and you can plug them into the situations that you want them to be in. But as the season goes along and you have these injuries, somebody like Mayowa or Jordan could step in. As far as I know, Jordan hasn't yet signed with the team. I'm sure he will very shortly. But Mayowa and Jordan both, especially Mayowa. Mayowa's the kind of guy that you would really love to have on the team. At $3 million, it's very low cost. It's very extremely low cost just to provide that depth. Seattle picks him up for $3 million, so I think that's a good signing for Seattle. So I think you are losing a little bit of depth here at defensive end. But I think starting-wise, you're fine. And I think in terms of depth, you're not absolutely hurting. Although I would maybe love to see them bring back Deion Jordan again here for $1 million, $1.5 million, something of that nature possibly, and just kind of keep somebody there. When you talk about depth, a player is only worth having if he's good on the football field. And with Jordan, you have here a guy who maybe you don't want to be starting. This is a guy who has started a lot, not going to be intimidated, not going to be pushed around. This is a guy here who does have talent and athleticism. So maybe I'd love to see Jordan bring back him. I would have loved to see Mayowa come back. He's gone. But at defensive end here, you have stayed solid. You move the defensive tackle here. Give me a second here. At defensive tackle, they didn't do much except bring in Malik Collins, but you didn't need to do much here. I already think you're good at defensive tackle. When you have, sorry, give me a second, let me roster, Hurst and Hall, whom I absolutely love. I think Hurst and Hall are a great combination together. I think they absolutely hold the fort down. Of course, you have Hankins there, Jonathan Hankins, who's a solid backup, very consistent, solid backup with starting experience, a guy who is solid, a guy who's not going to get pushed around, but no need to start him when you have Hurst and Hall. Hurst and Hall are still young enough where you hope they continue to develop and get better. So I really, really like what you have there in the middle with Hurst and Hall. They get some pressure on the quarterback. They're excellent against the run. You bring in guys here with Hankins and then with Collins here who are exactly the same way, and your defensive tackle rotation is set not only for the season but for each game, rotating these guys in and out, keeping them fresh. These are guys who won't get pushed around. They are solid against the run, and they do get some pressure on the quarterback. They do communicate well. They are solid. This is a good working defensive line. I like what you have at defensive tackle. I don't think you have any stars here with Hurst and Hall at defensive tackle, although at some point it wouldn't surprise me at all. Matter of fact, I'd be a little surprised if Hurst and Hall at some point in their career didn't challenge for Pro Bowl considerations. I don't think you have stars here on the defensive line, but I think you're rock solid all the way across. I think the depth is certainly there at defensive tackle when you look at what they have. So that's all the defense here. Again, there's no red spots here to me. When I look at the roster, I don't see any red spots at all. I see all blue for solid and green for good. The offensive line, we have not talked about that hardly at all yet today. At tackle to me is the weaker part of the offensive line, but it's not a trouble spot. It's not a weak spot. I think Colton Miller, we saw him progress and improve last year. You would love to see him. I think he's in his 3rd season. You would love to see him really step up and lock down a starting tackle spot this season. And then, of course, Trent Brown. Trent Brown's a guy, and I mentioned this about other people in other places earlier. Trent Brown's a guy who played really well for other teams in other places, comes to you, and he did not play that great last year. He wasn't bad. He was decent. He was solid as a starter for you last year at that left tackle position. But Brown's a guy that you're paying money to, and you'd like to see him step up and just really be the guy for you at tackle this year that he was in other places. You would really have to see that. So you're solid there at tackle, and then you go over here to guard center position, and I think, assuming everybody's coming back healthy, assuming everybody's not getting old all of a sudden, I think you're good here at the guard center position. You do have some age questions here at the guard center positions. Incognito and Jackson and who's my other guy here at guard? Sorry, I'm blanking on that right now. Denzel Good's a younger guy who seems to be like he could provide your depth. You wouldn't mind him starting for four games out of a year. Hudson, of course, the center. Hudson and Incognito really made the difference last year on the interior of the offensive line. They were outstanding at the guard center combo, and then Gabe Jackson stepped up and had a pretty good season as well. But the point being, with Hudson, with Incognito, with Jackson on the interior of the offensive line, you are starting to get long in the tooth. At some point, you expect a drop-off here just due to age, if nothing else. You also know that with that age, you are more injury-prone. The Raiders are ready for that, though, with Denzel Good. Good is a guy who I really would not feel that great entering the season with him being my starter, but I love having him there as a backup. I would feel perfectly fine with Denzel Good stepping in at guard for 4 games this year due to injury, or maybe 8 games this season due to injury, or if, oh my gosh, somebody got injured at guard heading into the playoffs. I think Denzel Good is good enough to step up in there and contribute and not be a sore point, not be a weak spot on the team. He may be possibly, conceivably, if he develops, I don't know that he's going to be this. He could be a decent starter in the NFL. I think that's still yet to be proven there, but with Good there, I think you have a guy there who does truly provide the depth. The other thing is, too, here, though, you had Joe Simpson here from Clemson coming in at guard as well. The Raiders did here something that I think all NFL teams should do. Maybe not every single season, but most seasons. I think it's always smart to use at least one draft pick on the offensive line. Even if it's a 5th-round draft pick, I think it's just a good idea to try to keep some kind of steady infusion of talent and growth there, because offensive linemen, for the most part, minus a few guys, offensive linemen take a very long time to develop and grow. So you'd like for them to be able to get 2 or 3 seasons under their belt of development before you just throw them in there as a starter. Some rookies can step in and do that right away. Most offensive linemen take a while to develop, so I really like here what they did here with Simpson at guard. Did they need a guard this year? Not necessarily, but you're getting old here at the guard center position with Hudson, Incognito, and Jackson. You're going to need the guard at some point. This is the perfect thing to do right here. This is a smart thing to do. You have a guy here I think is ready to contribute right away. I think Simpson is ready to contribute right away. Excuse me, let me get some Mountain Dew. Not ready to be a starter, but you have a guy here who is ready, I think, to contribute right away. So I really like the Simpson pick as well. I think we've covered everybody here on the draft board here. We've covered the offensive line. Tight end, I think, is the last position we're going to cover before we talk about backup quarterback. You look at tight end, you were already good. You had a right to question with Waller and Moreau. They both looked good last season. They both had outstanding seasons last year. Both had outstanding seasons as tight end. I thought you felt good about tight end even before the offseason, looking at 2020. You had the right to question, though, if somebody gets injured, who plays. You also had the right to question, though, Waller and Moreau, are they both going to come back and have excellent seasons, or was that just kind of a flash in the pan? Was that just kind of a product of Derek Carr being the quarterback, or are these guys going to continue to step up and be good here? So what the Raiders went out and did was they picked up Jason Witten here at tight end, 1 year, $4 million. Witten's not going to be the starter. I would be shocked, absolutely shocked, if Witten is the starter. I think at this point in his career, he's a little bit, he's already retired once. I don't think he can bear up under the load of 1,000 snaps and do it without an injury. So I think Witten is there to be that tight end 2 or maybe even tight end 3. It would be wonderful for the Raiders if Witten turns out to be tight end 3, because Waller and Moreau just turn out to have 2 more exceptional seasons this year for the Raiders, and that would turn Witten here into just a beautiful luxury here in case of an injury. But Witten's there. Witten can still catch the football. Witten can still block. I just don't think he can do it week in and week out for an entire game every single week. And so had the Raiders not had these 2 tight ends here and they brought Witten in to try to fill in the starting spot, that to me would be a sign of weakness on the roster. That would be a sign of worry. But if you have Witten here as tight end 2 or tight end 3, I think it's an awesome thing here for the Raiders. I think it's an absolutely beautiful decision here. We know he can still catch the football. We know he can block. And there's no pressure on him to try to do it for an entire game or for an entire season. He's there if you need him. You work him into the rotation, and I think he'll be a great fit here with the Raiders and with John Gruden and with Derek Carr. So I really like that decision right there to bring in Jason Witten. Let's talk about Marcus Mariota, okay, here for a second. 2 years, $18 million. That's $9 million here a season sitting on the bench. It's a very expensive insurance policy. It's an insurance policy with high premiums, but the payoff here could be huge. We really don't even want to think about an injury to our starting quarterback, no matter what team you are. I don't care if your quarterback started as Tom Brady, or if you're the Jets with Sam Darnold, or if you're the Detroit Lions. You don't even want to think about your starter getting injured. But in case Derek Carr were to get injured, Marcus Mariota could step in and carry the load for a while. Now, if Carr were to get injured and couldn't play in the playoffs, I would be absolutely sick as a Raiders fan. I don't want Marcus Mariota trying to carry me through the playoffs. I would be sick. But if Derek Carr were to get injured during week 2, week 4, week 10, I feel very confident, 100% confident, that Marcus Mariota could come in and carry the load. Would there be a drop-off? Yes, there would, but I think the Raiders could still have a fighting chance of continuing to compete and continuing to win games. And the difference is huge. We saw this with the New York Jets last year for a short period of time. Even Sam Darnold, who has not yet stepped up and shown that he's an absolute lockdown starter in this league, when he went down, the Jets went down too. We saw it to an even greater extent with the Detroit Lions last year. When Matthew Stafford went down, I think the Raiders went 0-8 without him. It was an absolute disaster for Detroit. Detroit was a team who had every reason to expect to try to be in the playoffs, and Matthew Stafford goes down. They go 0-8 without him. It was an absolute train wreck for the Detroit Lions. And if you're the Raiders here, you have bought yourself an expensive insurance policy that you hope you never have to use. That's the beauty of an insurance policy. You hope you never have to use it, but if you do, I wouldn't want this for the playoffs. I'd still be sick to death if there was an injury to Carr heading into the playoffs. But for the regular season, Mariota, absolutely, no doubt about it. Athleticism, got a strong enough throwing arm, got a starting experience. This is a guy who absolutely could step in for you for a month, or maybe even half a season. And your season doesn't go down in flames because of one position, the most important position in today's NFL, quarterback spot, because you didn't have a good backup. You've got a guy here with Mariota who absolutely can step in here and carry the load for a while if he needs to, all right? Because you've got the weapons here with running back, a wide receiver, and tight end. You've got a decent offensive line. It projects to be a decent offensive line in front of him this offseason. You've got a defense here who's not the weak sisters of the league anymore. I expect this to be a middle-of-the-pack defense this year. So you've got everything in place there, and the last thing you want is to get a roster here in place that's ready to get a playoff spot and maybe even do a little damage in the playoffs, and all of a sudden you get an injury to your quarterback and the whole season falls apart and the whole thing just burns up. That's the last thing you want. And so the Raiders here, I really like what they have done here with the Marcus Mariota thing. At first, it surprised me. When I saw it, I thought, well, maybe they're going to go draft a quarterback and then trade Carr because financially they're not tied to him anymore. They could do that. And then they didn't do that. And so I like what they did here with Mariota. Again, $9 million a season, not cheap. All right, there's a price to be paid for this. Could they have plugged in somebody else with this money? Yes, they could have. But the difference wouldn't be as great as if it would have been if Derek Carr were to go down with injury. You've got this guy here stepping in and I think able to just kind of keep on. At least you go 500 here, I think, with Mariota here playing quarterback, unless you're just playing some of the top teams in the league during the stretch that Mariota happens to be playing quarterback. This is excellent. I added in Rod Smith here, 1 year, $1 million. Smith really is just more for special teams. That was just an effort to show you what they had done here with lining up. I think we covered everything on the board. If you are still listening, bless your heart. I don't know why you're still listening to this video, but thank you for watching us today. One more thing. Usually every one of my videos comes with one mistake. Not on purpose. I try to have 0 mistakes, but usually every one of my videos has at least one mistake in it. So if you see that accidental Easter egg in here somewhere, let me know in the comments section. I appreciate the collaboration. If I see it and I agree with it, I try to either address it in the comments or maybe address it in the next team video that we do. Thank you so much. As the off season goes on, pushing into the regular season, we'll try to address each of these position groups individually and start to talk about more of them in depth and really look at those. Have a great one. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.